Snow White and Rose Red. A poor widow lived alone in a small cottage. In front of the cottage was a garden where two rose bushes grew, one bearing white roses and the other red. She had two children who resembled the two rose bushes. One was named Snow White and the other Rose Red. They were as pious and good, as industrious and cheerful as any children ever were. Snow White was quieter and more gentle than Rose Red. Rose Red preferred running around in the meadows and fields, seeking flowers and catching butterflies, while Snow White stayed at home with their mother, helping with the household chores or reading to her when there was nothing else to do. The two children loved each other so dearly that they always held hands when they went out together. When Snow White said, "We will never leave each other," Rose Red would respond, "Not as long as we live." And their mother would add, "Whatever one has, she must share with the other." They often wandered alone in the forest, gathering red berries, but no animal ever harmed them. Instead, the animals came trustingly near. The little hare would eat a cabbage leaf from their hands, the roe grazed by their side, the stag leaped happily past them, and the birds sat on the branches and sang their songs. No misfortune ever befell them. If they stayed too late in the forest and night overtook them, they lay down together on the moss and slept until morning, and their mother knew this and had no worries about them. Once, when they had spent the night in the forest and dawn awoke them, they saw a beautiful child in a shining white dress sitting near their bed. He stood up, looked at them kindly, but said nothing, and went into the forest. When they looked around, they realized they had slept near a precipice and would have certainly fallen into it if they had taken a few more steps in the dark. Their mother told them it must have been the angel who watches over good children. Snow White and Rose Red kept their mother's cottage so clean that it was a joy to look inside. In the summer, Rose Red took care of the house and placed a bouquet of flowers by her mother's bed every morning before she awoke, with a rose from each bush. In the winter, Snow White lit the fire and hung the kettle on the hook, and the kettle, made of brass, shone like gold from being so well polished. In the evenings, when the snowflakes fell, the mother would say, "Go, Snow White, and bolt the door," and they would sit by the hearth, and the mother would put on her glasses and read aloud from a large book, while the two girls listened and spun. Beside them lay a lamb on the floor, and behind them on a perch sat a white dove with its head tucked under its wing. One evening, as they sat comfortably together, someone knocked at the door, as if seeking to be let in. The mother said, "Quick, Rose Red, open the door. It must be a traveler seeking shelter." Rose Red went and pushed back the bolt, expecting to see a poor man, but it was not a man. It was a bear that thrust his thick black head through the doorway. Rose Red screamed and jumped back. The lamb bleated, the dove fluttered, and Snow White hid behind her mother's bed. However, the bear began to speak and said, "Do not be afraid. I will do you no harm. I am half frozen and merely wish to warm myself a little." "Poor bear," said the mother, "come and lie by the fire, but take care that you do not burn your fur." She then called out, "Snow White, Rose Red, come out. The bear will not harm you. He means well." They both came closer, and gradually the lamb and the dove also approached and had no fear of him. The bear said, "Children, knock the snow a little off my fur." And they brought the broom and brushed the bear's coat clean. He then stretched himself by the fire and growled contentedly and comfortably. Before long, they became so familiar with him that they began to play with their clumsy guest. They tugged his fur with their hands, put their feet on his back and rolled him here and there, or took a hazel switch and beat him, and when he growled, they laughed. The bear took it all in good part. Only when they became too rough, he called out, "Leave me my life, children. Snow White, Rose Red, you are beating your lover dead." When it was time for bed, and the others went to bed, the mother said to the bear, "You can lie there by the hearth in God's name. You will be safe from the cold and the bad weather." As soon as day broke, the children let him out, and he trotted over the snow into the forest. From then on, the bear came every evening at the same time, lay by the hearth, and allowed the children to amuse themselves with him as much as they wanted. They became so accustomed to him that the door was never bolted in the evening until their black friend had arrived. When spring came and everything outside was green, The bear said one morning to Snow White, "Now I must go away and cannot return the whole summer." "Where are you going, dear bear?" asked Snow White. "I must go to the forest and guard my treasures from the wicked dwarfs. In the winter, when the earth is frozen hard, they must stay below and cannot work their way through. But now, when the sun has thawed and warmed the earth, they break through, come up, search, and steal. What once gets into their hands and into their caves does not easily see daylight again." Snow White was quite sad at his departure, and when she unbolted the door for him, and the bear hastily pushed out, he caught on the door hook and a piece of his skin tore off, and it seemed to Snow White as if she had seen gold shining through it. However, she was not sure of it. The bear ran away quickly and was soon out of sight behind the trees. After some time, the mother sent the children into the forest to gather wood. There they found a large tree lying on the ground, and something was jumping up and down on the trunk among the grass, but they couldn't make out what it was. When they came closer, they saw a dwarf with an old, withered face and an ell-long snow-white beard. The end of the beard was stuck in a crack in the tree, and the little man was jumping back and forth like a dog on a leash and didn't know how to free himself. He glared at the girls with his fiery red eyes and shouted, "What are you standing there for? Can't you come over and help me?" "What have you gotten yourself into, little man?" asked Rose Red. "You stupid, inquisitive goose," replied the dwarf. "I wanted to split the tree to get some small wood for the kitchen. Thick logs burn up the little bit of food that someone like me needs, who doesn't gobble down as much as you coarse, greedy folk. I had driven the wedge in nicely, and everything would have gone according to plan. But the cursed wood was too smooth and suddenly sprang out, and the tree snapped shut so quickly that I couldn't pull out my lovely white beard. Now it's stuck, and I can't get away. There you go, laughing at me, you silly milk-faced brats. Ugh, how nasty you are." The children tried everything, but they couldn't pull the beard out. It was stuck too fast. "I'll run and fetch some people," said Rose Red. "You crazy sheepheads," snarled the dwarf. "Who would call for more people? 2 are already too many for me. Can't you think of something better?" "Don't be impatient," said Snow White. "I'll come up with something." She pulled out her scissors from her pocket and cut off the end of the beard. As soon as the dwarf felt himself free, he grabbed a sack full of gold that was stuck among the tree roots, lifted it out, and grumbled, "Rough people, cutting a piece of my fine beard off. May the devil pay you back." With that, he swung the sack over his back and went off without even looking at the children. A while later, Snow White and Rose Red wanted to catch some fish. When they got near the stream, they saw something that looked like a large grasshopper jumping towards the water as if it wanted to jump in. They ran up and recognized the dwarf. "Where are you going?" said Rose Red. "Surely you don't want to jump into the water?" "I'm not that foolish," screamed the dwarf. "Can't you see that the cursed fish wants to pull me in?" The little man had been sitting there fishing, and unfortunately, the wind had tangled his beard with the fishing line. Right after that, a big fish bit, and the weak little creature didn't have the strength to pull it out. The fish got the upper hand and pulled the dwarf towards it. He clung to every blade of grass and rush, but it didn't help much. He had to follow the movements of the fish and was in constant danger of being pulled into the water. The girls arrived just in time, held him tight, and tried to free his beard from the line, but it was in vain. Beard and line were tangled together. There was nothing left but to bring out the scissors and cut the beard, losing a small part of it in the process. When the dwarf saw this, he shouted at them, "Is that manners, you clumsy louts, to disfigure someone's face? Not only did you shorten my beard from below, but now you've cut off the best part of it. I can't show myself to my people. May you run till you lose the soles off your shoes." Then he grabbed a sack of pearls that was lying in the reeds, and without another word, he dragged it away and disappeared behind a stone. It happened that shortly afterward, the mother sent the 2 girls to town to buy thread, needles, cords, and ribbons. The path led them across a heath where massive rocks were scattered here and there. They saw a large bird hovering in the air, slowly circling above them, descending lower and lower until it finally landed not far from a rock. They immediately heard a piercing, pitiful scream. Running towards the sound, they saw with horror that the eagle had grabbed their old acquaintance, the dwarf, and was about to carry him off. The compassionate children quickly held the little man tight and tugged so long at the eagle that it let go of its prey. Once the dwarf recovered from the initial shock, he screamed in his shrill voice, "Couldn't you have handled me more carefully? You've torn my thin little coat to shreds and tatters, you clumsy and awkward lot that you are." Then he picked up a sack of precious stones and slipped back under the rock into his cave. The girls were already used to his ingratitude, continued on their way, and completed their errands in town. On their way back, as they were crossing the heath again, they came upon the dwarf, who had emptied his sack of precious stones on a clean spot and didn't think anyone would come by so late. The evening sun shone over the sparkling stones, which shimmered and glowed in all colors so beautifully that the children stopped and gazed at them. "What are you standing there for, gaping like fools?" shouted the dwarf, and his ash-gray face turned vermilion with rage. He was about to continue his tirade when a loud growling was heard, and a black bear came trotting out of the forest. Terrified, the dwarf jumped up but couldn't reach his hiding place. The bear was already close to him. In a panic, he cried out, "Dear Miss Dow, bear, spare me, I will give you all my treasures. Look at the beautiful gems lying there. Grant me my life. What do you want with a small, meager creature like me? You wouldn't even feel me between your teeth. There, take those godless girls. They are tender morsels, fat as young quails. Eat them in God's name." The bear paid no attention to his words and gave the wicked creature a single blow with his paw, leaving him lifeless. The girls had run away, but the bear called after them, "Snow White and Rose Red, do not be afraid. Wait, I will go with you." Recognizing his voice, they stopped, and as the bear approached them, the bear's skin suddenly fell off, revealing a handsome man dressed entirely in gold. "I am a king's son," he said, "and was cursed by the wicked dwarf who had stolen my treasures to roam the forest as a wild bear until his death would set me free. Now he has received his well-deserved punishment." Snow White was married to him, and Rose Red to his brother, and they shared the great treasures the dwarf had gathered in his cave. The old mother lived peacefully and happily with her children for many years. She took the 2 rose bushes with her, and they stood in front of her window, bearing the most beautiful roses, white and red, every year. The wise servant. How fortunate is the master, and how well it goes in his house, when he has a wise servant who listens to his words, but does not act on them and prefers to follow his own wisdom. Such a clever Hans was once sent out by his master to look for a lost cow. He stayed away a long time, and the master thought, "Faithful Hans does not spare any effort in his service." However, when he did not come back at all, the master feared that something might have happened to him, so he set out himself to look for him. He had to search for a long time, but finally he saw the servant running up and down in a large field. "Now, dear Hans," said the master when he caught up with him, "have you found the cow that I sent you to look for?" "No, master," he answered. "I have not found the cow, but I also did not look for it." "What did you look for, Hans?" "Something better and that I have luckily found." "What is that, Hans?" "3 blackbirds," answered the servant. "And where are they?" asked the master. "I see one, I hear the other, and I am chasing the third," answered the wise servant. Take this as an example. Do not worry about your master and his orders. Rather do what comes to your mind and what you feel like doing. Then you will act just as wisely as the clever Hans. The Glass Coffin. A fairy tale by the Brothers Grimm. Never let it be said that a poor tailor cannot achieve great things and attain high honors. All that is necessary is for him to find the right forge and, most importantly, to have good fortune. Once a clever and agile apprentice tailor set out on a journey and found himself in a vast forest where he lost his way. Night descended, leaving him no choice but to seek shelter in this desolate solitude. He could have found a comfortable bed on the soft moss, but fear of wild animals prevented him from resting there, forcing him, at last, to decide to spend the night in a tree. He found a tall oak, climbed to the top, and was thankful he had his iron with him. Otherwise, the wind blowing over the top of the tree would have taken him away. After spending several hours in the darkness, Filled with fear and uncertainty, he saw a faint light not far away. Thinking it might be a human dwelling where he could find better refuge than in the tree branches, he cautiously climbed down and followed the light. It led him to a small hut woven from reeds and rushes. He knocked boldly, the door opened, and by the light that spilled out, he saw an elderly man dressed in a coat pieced together from colorful scraps. "Who are you, and what do you want?" asked the man in a gruff voice. "I am a poor tailor," he replied, "caught in the wilderness by night, and I beg you earnestly to take me into your hut until morning." "Be off with you," replied the old man, sounding surly. "I want nothing to do with vagabonds. Find yourself shelter elsewhere." With these words, he tried to slip back into his hut, but the tailor held onto the hem of his coat, pleading so earnestly that the old man, not as mean as he pretended to be, relented and led him into the hut, where he fed him and showed him a good bed in a corner. The weary tailor needed no persuading. He slept soundly until morning, but would not have woken if not for a loud commotion. A fierce clamor of screams and roars penetrated the thin walls of the hut. The tailor, suddenly brave, jumped up, hastily dressed, and hurried outside. Nearby, he saw a large black bull and a beautiful stag locked in a fierce battle. They charged at each other with such fury that the ground shook beneath them, and the air echoed with their cries. It was unclear for a long time which would emerge victorious. Finally, the stag drove its antlers into the bull's body, causing it to collapse with a deafening roar, and the stag finished it off with a few more blows. The tailor, who had watched the fight with astonishment, was still standing there motionless when the stag suddenly bounded up to him in full speed, and before he could react, lifted him up on its large horns. He had little time to gather his thoughts as they raced swiftly over hills and valleys, through woods and meadows. Gripping the horns tightly with both hands, he resigned himself to his fate, feeling as if he were flying away. Eventually, the stag halted in front of a rocky wall and gently lowered the tailor to the ground. More dead than alive, the tailor took a while to recover. The stag, standing nearby, then pushed forcefully against a door set in the rock, causing it to spring open. Flames burst forth, followed by a thick smoke that obscured the stag from view. The tailor, uncertain of what to do or where to go to escape this wilderness and return to civilization, stood undecided. Just then, a voice echoed from within the rock, saying, "Enter without fear, no harm shall befall you." Hesitant, but compelled by some unseen force, he obeyed the voice and passed through the iron door into a vast, spacious hall. The ceiling, walls, and floor were made of polished, gleaming square stones, each engraved with unfamiliar letters. He gazed around in awe at everything, on the verge of leaving when the voice spoke again, urging him, "Step onto the stone in the center of the hall, and great fortune awaits you." His courage bolstered, he obeyed without hesitation. The stone beneath his feet began to sink slowly into the depths. When it finally stabilized and he looked around, he found himself in a hall similar in size to the previous one, but even more stunning. Hollowed niches in the walls held vases of transparent glass filled with colored spirits or bluish vapors. Across from each other on the hall's floor stood two large glass chests that immediately piqued his curiosity. Approaching one, he peered inside to find an intricate structure resembling a castle, surrounded by farm buildings, stables, barns, and numerous other details. Everything was small, yet meticulously crafted, as if by a skilled hand with utmost precision. The tailor, who had been captivated by this marvel, might have continued gazing at it for some time, if the voice had not once again made itself heard. Commanding him to turn around and look at the glass chest opposite, his admiration grew even more upon seeing a maiden of extraordinary beauty inside. She lay as if asleep, her long, fair hair draped around her like a precious mantle. Though her eyes were closed, the radiance of her complexion and the ribbon fluttering with her breath left no doubt she was alive. The tailor, his heart pounding with awe, was observing her when she suddenly opened her eyes and, upon seeing him, started up in joyful terror. "Heaven above!" she exclaimed. "My deliverance is at hand. Quick, quick, help me out of this prison. If you push back the bolt of this glass coffin, then I shall be free." Without hesitation, the tailor obeyed, and she immediately lifted the glass lid, emerged, and swiftly covered herself with a large cloak in the corner of the hall. Sitting on a stone, she beckoned the young man to her, and after planting a friendly kiss on his lips, she spoke. My long-awaited savior, kind heaven has guided you to me and ended my sorrows. On the very day they cease, your happiness shall begin. You are the husband chosen for me by heaven, destined to live a life of unbroken joy, loved by me, and overflowing with every earthly blessing. Sit down and listen to my story. I am the daughter of a wealthy count. My parents passed away when I was still young, leaving me under the care of my elder brother, who raised me. We loved each other dearly and were so alike in our thoughts and desires that we vowed never to marry but to remain together for life. Our home was always bustling with guests. Neighbors and friends visited frequently, and we extended the warmest hospitality to all. One evening, a stranger rode to our castle and, claiming he couldn't continue his journey, requested shelter for the night. We gladly accommodated him, and during supper, he entertained us with engaging conversation and stories. My brother took such a liking to the stranger that he asked him to stay a few more days, to which he reluctantly agreed. We didn't retire until late that night. The stranger was shown to his room, and I, feeling weary, retired to my soft bed. Hardly had I fallen asleep when I was awakened by faint, delightful music. Confused about its source, I tried to summon my maid from the adjacent room, but to my astonishment, I found myself unable to speak, as if some unseen weight pressed upon my chest, rendering me mute. By the light of my bedside lamp, I saw the stranger enter my room through two locked doors. He approached and explained that through his magic arts, he had conjured the music to awaken me, and now, breaking through all barriers, he intended to offer me his hand and heart. My aversion to his sorcery was so strong that I did not respond. He stood silently for a while, seemingly waiting for a favorable reply. But as I remained silent, he left angrily, vowing revenge and threatening to find ways to punish my pride. I spent the night in great distress, only drifting off to sleep towards dawn. When I awoke, I rushed to my brother's room, but he was not there. The servants informed me he had gone out at daybreak with the stranger for a hunt. I immediately suspected trouble. I quickly dressed myself, had my palfrey saddled, and rode at full gallop into the forest with only one servant accompanying me. Unfortunately, my servant fell from his horse, which had broken its foot, and couldn't follow me. Without stopping, I continued on my way, and within minutes encountered the stranger approaching me with a beautiful stag on a leash. I demanded to know where he had left my brother and how he had obtained the stag, whose large eyes were streaming with tears. Instead of answering, he burst into loud laughter. Enraged, I drew my pistol and fired at the fiend, but the bullet bounced off his chest and struck my horse in the head. I fell to the ground, and as I lost consciousness, the stranger muttered incantations. When I awoke, I found myself in this underground cavern in a glass coffin. The sorcerer reappeared and explained that he had transformed my brother into a stag, reduced my castle and all its belongings with his magic into the other glass chest, and imprisoned my people, turned into smoke, in glass bottles. He told me that if I complied with his demands now, he could easily restore everything to its original state by simply opening the vessels. I gave him no more response than I had initially. He vanished, leaving me in my prison, where I fell into a deep sleep. Among the visions that passed before me, the most comforting was one in which a young man came and liberated me. Today, upon awakening, I saw you and witnessed my dream come true. Help me fulfill the remaining visions. The first is to lift the glass chest containing my castle onto that broad stone. As soon as the stone was loaded, it began to rise with the maiden and the young man, ascending through the ceiling opening into the upper hall. From there, they easily reached the open air. The maiden opened the lid, and it was astonishing to see how the castle, houses, and farm buildings inside stretched and rapidly returned to their natural size. Afterward, the maiden and the tailor returned to the underground cave and had the vessels filled with smoke brought up by the stone. As soon as she opened the bottles, blue smoke poured out and transformed into living men, her servants and people. Her joy knew no bounds when her brother, who had slain the magician in the form of the bull, emerged from the forest towards them in his human form. On that very day, true to her promise, the maiden married the fortunate tailor at the altar. Lazy Harry. A fairy tale by the brothers Grimm. Harry was lazy. Even though he had nothing else to do but drive his goat daily to pasture, he groaned when he returned home after finishing his day's work. "It is indeed a heavy burden," he said, "and a wearisome task to drive a goat into the field year after year, until late into autumn. If one could just lie down and sleep, but no, one must keep one's eyes open to prevent it from damaging young trees, squeezing through hedges into gardens, or even running away. How can one find any rest or peace in life?" He sat down, gathered his thoughts, and pondered how to rid his shoulders of this burden. For a long time, all his pondering was in vain, but suddenly it was as if scales fell from his eyes. "I know what I will do," he exclaimed. "I will marry Fat Trina, who also has a goat. She can take mine out with hers, and then I won't have to bother any more." So Harry got up, set his weary legs in motion, and went directly across the street, as it was not far, to where Fat Trina's parents lived. He asked for their industrious and virtuous daughter's hand in marriage. The parents did not hesitate long. Like attracts like, they thought, and agreed. Thus Fat Trina became Harry's wife and took both goats out to pasture. Harry had good days and needed no rest from any work but his own laziness. Occasionally, he would go out with her and say, "I only do this so that I can enjoy rest better afterwards. Otherwise, one loses all appreciation for it." However, Fat Trina was equally lazy. "Dear Harry," she said one day, "why should we make our lives so difficult when there's no need for it, thus wasting the best days of our youth? Wouldn't it be better for us to give away the 2 goats that disturb our sweetest morning sleep with their bleating to our neighbor? In exchange, he could give us a beehive. We'll place the beehive in a sunny spot behind the house and not worry about it anymore. Bees don't need to be herded or driven into the fields. They fly out, find their way home on their own, and gather honey without causing any trouble." "You've spoken wisely," replied Harry. "Let's carry out your suggestion without delay. Besides, honey tastes better and provides better nourishment than goat's milk, and it keeps longer too." The neighbor gladly exchanged a beehive for the 2 goats. The bees flew in and out from early morning until late evening without tiring, filling the hive with the most beautiful honey. In autumn, Harry was able to take a whole pitcherful from it. They placed the jug on a board fixed to the bedroom wall. Afraid it might be stolen or found by mice, Trina brought a sturdy hazel stick to keep by her bed, ready to drive away unwanted guests without unnecessary effort. Lazy Harry disliked leaving bed before noon. Early risers, he said, squander their wealth. One morning, still lying in bed in broad daylight after a long sleep, Harry said to his wife, "Women love sweet things, and you're always sampling the honey in secret. It would be better to trade it for a goose with a gosling before you finish it all." "However," Trina replied, "not until we have a child to tend them. Should I struggle with the young geese and expend my energy in vain?" "Do you believe," Harry asked, "that the child will care for the geese? Nowadays, children don't obey. They act as they please because they think they're smarter than their parents, just like the boy sent to find the cow who chased 3 blackbirds." "Oh," Trina answered, "he'll regret it if he doesn't obey me. I'll take a stick and thrash him with more blows than I can count." "See, Harry," she exclaimed fervently, grabbing the stick used to shoo away mice. "This is how I'll strike him." She reached out to hit but accidentally struck the honey pitcher above the bed. It crashed against the wall, shattering into pieces, and the precious honey spilled onto the floor. "There lies the goose and the gosling," said Harry, "needing no care, but it's fortunate the pitcher didn't fall on my head. We have every reason to be content with our lot." Seeing some honey still in one fragment, he reached for it and cheerfully said, "We'll enjoy what's left, my wife, and take a little rest after the scare. What does it matter if we rise later? The day is long enough." "Yes," Trina replied. "We'll always manage to finish in time. Did you know the snail once got invited to a wedding, but ended up at a christening? It stumbled over the fence in front of the house and remarked, 'Haste does no good.'" The Griffin. A fairy tale by the brothers Grimm. Once upon a time, there was a king, though where he reigned and what he was called, I do not know. He had no son, but an only daughter who had always been ill, and no doctor had been able to cure her. Then it was foretold to the king that his daughter should eat herself well with an apple. Therefore, he ordered throughout his whole kingdom that whoever brought his daughter an apple with which she could eat herself well should have her as his wife and become king. This became known to a peasant who had 3 sons, and he said to the eldest, "Go out into the garden and take a basketful of those beautiful apples with the red cheeks and carry them to the court. Perhaps the king's daughter will be able to eat herself well with them, and then you will marry her and become king." The lad did so and set out. When he had gone a short way, he met a little iron man who asked him what he had in the basket. Whaley, for that was his name, replied, "Frog's legs." Upon hearing this, the little man said, "Very well, so shall it be," and went away. Eventually, Whaley arrived at the palace and announced that he had brought apples that could cure the king's daughter if she ate them. This greatly pleased the king, and he summoned Whaley to appear before him. However, to their dismay, when he opened the basket, instead of finding apples, there were frog's legs still kicking about. This enraged the king, and he had Whaley driven out of the palace. When he returned home, he told his father what had happened to him. Then the father sent the second son, named Sime, but his fate was no different from Whaley's. He too encountered the little iron man who asked what he had in the basket. Sime replied, "Hog's bristles," and the iron man said, "Very well, so shall it be." When Sime arrived at the king's palace and claimed to have brought apples with which the king's daughter could eat herself well, they refused to let him in, citing that another person had already deceived them. Sime insisted that he indeed had the apples and pleaded to be let in. Finally, they believed him and brought him to the king. However, when he uncovered the basket, it contained only hog's bristles. This infuriated the king even more, and he ordered Sime to be whipped out of the palace. Upon returning home, Sime recounted all that had transpired to his father. Then the youngest son, named Hans, but often called Stupid Hans, came and asked his father if he could also take some apples. "Oh," said the father, "you would be just the right person for such a task. If the clever ones couldn't succeed, what can you do?" However, Hans did not let that discourage him and insisted, "Indeed, father, I want to go." "Just go away, you foolish boy. You have to wait until you're wiser," replied his father, turning away. Nonetheless, Hans tugged at the back of his smock frock and said, "Indeed, father, I want to go." "Well, then, as far as I'm concerned, you may go," replied the old man in a spiteful voice. However, the boy was tremendously delighted and jumped for joy. "Well, act like a fool. You grow more stupid every day," said the father again. Hans, though, did not care about that and did not let it spoil his pleasure. As it was night, he thought he might as well wait until the morrow, for he could not get to court that day. All night long he could not sleep in his bed, and if he did doze for a moment, he dreamt of beautiful maidens, palaces, gold, silver, and all sorts of things like that. Early in the morning, he set forth on his way, and shortly after, the little shabby-looking man in his iron clothes approached him and asked what he was carrying in the basket. Hans told him he was carrying apples with which the king's daughter was to eat herself well. "Then," said the little man, "so shall it be, and remain." However, at the court, they refused to let Hans in, claiming 2 others had already come who said they were bringing apples. One had frog's legs, and the other hog's bristles. Hans, though, insisted firmly that he certainly did not have frog's legs, but some of the most beautiful apples in the entire kingdom. As he spoke so pleasantly, the doorkeeper thought he could not be lying and allowed him to enter. He was right, for when Hans uncovered his basket before the king, golden yellow apples came tumbling out. The king was delighted and had some taken to his daughter, anxiously waiting for news of their effect. Before long, news arrived, but guess who brought it? It was his daughter herself. As soon as she had eaten those apples, she was cured and leaped out of her bed. The joy the king felt cannot be described. However, now he did not want to give his daughter in marriage to Hans, and said he must first make a boat that would travel faster on land than on water. Hans agreed to the conditions, went home, and told them what had happened to him. Then the father sent Uella into the forest to build such a boat. He worked diligently and whistled all the while. At midday, when the sun was at its highest, the little iron man came and asked what he was making. Willie replied, "Wooden bowls for the kitchen." The Iron Man said, "So shall it be and remain." By evening, Willie thought he had now made the boat, but when he tried to get into it, all he had was wooden bowls. The next day, Seam went into the forest, but everything happened to him just as it had to Whaley. On the third day, Stupid Hands went. He worked very hard, so that the whole forest resounded with heavy blows, and all the while he sang and whistled very cheerfully. At midday, when it was hottest, the little man came again and asked what he was making. "A boat that will travel faster on dry land than on water," replied Hans, "and when I've finished it, I'm supposed to marry the king's daughter." "Well," said the little man, "so shall it be and remain." In the evening, when the sun had turned to gold, Hans finished his boat and everything needed for it. He got into it and rowed to the palace. The boat sped like the wind. The king saw it from afar, but still would not give his daughter to Hans. He said he must first take 100 hares out to pasture from early morning until late evening, and if even one of them got away, he would not get his daughter. Hans agreed to this and went with his flock to the pasture the next day, taking great care to prevent any of them from escaping. Before many hours had passed, a servant from the palace arrived and informed Hans that he must immediately provide a hare, as unexpected guests had arrived. However, Hans knew exactly what that meant and refused to give her one. He suggested that the king could serve hare soup to his guests the next day. The maid, however, didn't believe him and began to grow angry. Hans then declared that he would only give a hare if the king's daughter came herself. The maid relayed this to the palace, and indeed, the daughter came. Meanwhile, the little man approached Hans again and inquired about his task. Hans explained that he had to watch over 100 hares and ensure none of them escaped, after which he could marry the king's daughter and become king. "Very well," said the little man. "Here is a whistle for you. If one runs away, just whistle, and it will come back." When the king's daughter arrived, Hans placed a hare in her apron. After she had walked about 100 steps, he whistled, and the hare jumped out and returned to the flock before she could react. In the evening, the hare herd whistled again, checked that all were present, and drove them back to the palace. The king marveled at how Hans managed to graze 100 hares without losing any. Nevertheless, he refused to give Hans his daughter yet, and demanded that he now bring back a feather from the griffin's tail. Hans immediately set off and walked straight ahead. In the evening, he reached a castle where he requested lodging for the night, as there were no inns at that time. The lord of the castle gladly agreed and inquired about Hans's destination. Hans replied, "To the griffin." The lord expressed his wish for Hans to ask the griffin about the whereabouts of a lost key to an iron money chest, as the griffin was said to know everything. Hans agreed to do so. Early the next morning, he continued his journey and arrived at another castle, where he stayed overnight. The inhabitants there informed him of their sick daughter, whom they had tried unsuccessfully to cure. They asked Hans to inquire of the griffin what could restore her health. Hans agreed and continued on his way. He eventually arrived at a lake where there was no ferry, but a tall man who carried travelers across. The man asked Hans where he was headed. "To the griffin," replied Hans. The man requested Hans to ask the griffin why he was compelled to ferry everyone across the lake. Hans promised to do so, and the man carried him across on his shoulders. Finally, Hans reached the griffin's house, but only the wife was home, not the griffin himself. The woman asked him what he wanted. Upon hearing this, he disclosed everything. He had to obtain a feather from the griffin's tail, locate a castle where they had lost the key to their money chest and inquire about its whereabouts, visit another castle where a daughter was ill and discover a cure, and nearby, find out why a man was compelled to ferry people across a lake. The woman responded, "Well, my good friend, no one can speak to the griffin and survive. He devours them all. However, if you wish, you can hide under his bed. When he's fast asleep at night, you can reach out and pluck a feather from his tail. I'll find out about those other matters myself." Hans agreed to this plan and slipped under the bed. In the evening, the griffin returned home. Upon entering, he declared, "Wife, I smell a Christian." The woman calmly replied, "Yes, one was here today, but he left." Satisfied with her answer, the griffin said no more. In the dead of night, while the griffin snored loudly, Hans cautiously reached out and plucked a feather from his tail. The griffin abruptly woke and exclaimed, "Wife, I smell a Christian! It seems someone was pulling my tail." His wife dismissed his suspicions, saying, "You must have been dreaming. I already told you a Christian was here today." But he left. He mentioned that in one castle, they lost the key to their money chest and couldn't find it. The griffin scoffed. "What fools! The key is in the woodshed under a log behind the door." And he mentioned another castle where a daughter was ill, and they couldn't find a remedy, she continued. The griffin retorted, "More fools. A toad has nested under the cellar steps with her hair. If she gets her hair back, she'll recover." He also mentioned a place near here with a lake, and a man forced to ferry people across, she added. The griffin laughed. "What a fool! If he simply put one person down in the middle, he'd never need to ferry anyone else." The next morning, the griffin rose and left the house. Then Hans emerged from under the bed, clutching a beautiful feather and having heard all that the griffin had disclosed about the key, the daughter, and the ferryman. The griffin's wife repeated everything once more to ensure he remembered, and then he returned home. His first stop was at the lake, where the man awaited eagerly to hear what the griffin had said. Hans insisted the man ferry him across first, promising to share the news afterward. After the crossing, Hans revealed that placing one person in the middle of the lake would solve his ferrying troubles forever. Delighted, the man offered to ferry Hans across again out of gratitude, but Hans declined, content with his satisfaction, and continued on his way. Next, he arrived at the castle where the daughter lay ill. He lifted her onto his shoulders since she couldn't walk, carried her downstairs, removed the toad's nest from beneath the lowest step, and placed it in her hand. She immediately sprang off his shoulders, climbed the stairs ahead of him, and was completely healed. Overjoyed, her parents showered Hans with gifts of gold, silver, and anything else he desired. Proceeding to the other castle, Hans went directly to the woodshed, found the key under the log behind the door, and presented it to the castle's lord. Pleased, the lord rewarded Hans generously with gold from the chest, as well as cattle and other livestock. When Hans returned before the king with all his newfound wealth, money, gold, silver, cows, sheep, and goats, the king inquired how he had acquired such riches. Hans explained that the griffin granted whatever one desired. Convinced of the griffin's power, the king set off to find it himself. Arriving at the lake, he happened to be the first to arrive after Hans. The ferryman placed him in the middle of the lake and left him there, and the king drowned. Hans, however, married the daughter and ascended to the throne, becoming king himself.